Hey everyone, tonight we descend deep into the scandalous, absurd, and occasionally horrifying personal lives of history's most powerful figures. We're exploring the bedrooms, bathhouses, and banquet halls of China's most depraved emperors, where absolute power met absolutely no self-control. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Yang Guang, known to history as Emperor Yang of Sui, ruled from 604 to 618 CE, and spent most of that time proving that unlimited power and unlimited horniness make for spectacularly bad governance. He began his reign with ambitious infrastructure projects like the Grand Canal, which was actually useful. Then he discovered that being emperor meant he could build whatever he wanted, and what he wanted was essentially a theme park for his libido. Yang constructed the Western Park, a massive complex outside his capital that wasn't so much a garden as it was a carefully landscaped sex resort. The park covered several square miles and included artificial lakes, imported exotic animals, and strategically placed pavilions where the emperor could entertain his constantly rotating roster of concubines. But Yang wasn't content with traditional imperial harems. He reportedly maintained over 3,000 women in various capacities, from official consorts to what the court records euphemistically called palace entertainers. The emperor's idea of a romantic evening involved elaborate theatrical productions, where he and his chosen companions would dress as mythological figures and act out increasingly ridiculous scenarios. One chronicler noted that Yang once spent 3 weeks staging a production where he played the Jade Emperor seducing various celestial maidens, played by his concubines. The performances apparently included full orchestras, elaborate costumes, and what medieval Chinese historians described as activities unsuitable for recording. Yang's appetites weren't limited to his own palaces. He developed a habit of inspecting provincial mansions, which really meant showing up unannounced at wealthy families' homes and expecting to be entertained by their daughters and wives. This wasn't subtle royal flirtation. This was state-sponsored harassment with a crown. Local officials learned to hide their female relatives when the emperor's entourage approached, leading to what historians call the vanishing women phenomenon whenever Yang travelled. But perhaps Yang's most notorious creation was the dragon boat processions. These weren't simple river cruises. Yang commissioned massive floating palaces, some over 200 feet long, decorated with silk, gold, and precious stones. The boats were equipped with private chambers, elaborate dining rooms, and what court records describe as special entertainment areas. He would travel these waterways with flotillas of smaller boats, carrying musicians, dancers, and his extensive collection of travelling companions. The emperor's excesses became so legendary that rebellions began forming specifically around opposition to his lifestyle. It wasn't just about taxes or military campaigns. People were genuinely offended by their leaders' public displays of indulgence. Yang's response was to build an even larger pleasure complex and declare that criticism of imperial recreation was treason. Eventually, Yang's obsession with personal pleasure completely derailed his ability to govern. While he was busy staging elaborate romantic fantasies in his Western Park, the empire was collapsing around him. Rebellions erupted across China, foreign enemies invaded, and the imperial treasury was drained. Yang was assassinated in 618 by his own generals, who had apparently decided that a leader more interested in costume parties than military strategy was a liability. Yang's reign serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when absolute power meets zero self-restraint. He had the resources to build wonders, the authority to reshape an empire, and the opportunity to create lasting greatness. Instead, he chose to build the world's most expensive brothel and call it governance. Not exactly the legacy most emperors aim for, but certainly memorable. Li Longji, known as Emperor Xuanzong, ruled during the Tang dynasty from 7112 to 756 CE, and his reign perfectly illustrates how even capable rulers can be completely derailed by poor romantic decisions. Xuanzong started out promisingly enough. He was intelligent, cultured, and genuinely interested in effective governance. Then he discovered the joy of collecting beautiful women, like other people collect pottery, and things went downhill from there. Xuanzong's harem was legendary, even by imperial standards. Official records mention over 40,000 women in various roles throughout his palaces, though that number likely included servants, entertainers, and administrative staff. What made Xuanzong different from other emperors wasn't just the quantity of his romantic interests, but his systematic approach to acquiring them. He established what was essentially a talent scouting network across the empire, with officials tasked with identifying and recruiting attractive young women for imperial service. The emperor developed elaborate ranking systems for his concubines, complete with titles, allowances, and specific duties. It was like a medieval bureaucracy, but for bedroom management. Women were categorized as noble consorts, consorts of the first rank, consorts of the second rank, and so on, down to basic palace ladies. Each rank came with different colored silk robes, different jewelry allowances, and different access to the emperor's personal quarters. Some historians suggest Xuanzong spent more time organizing his romantic life than running the country. But Xuanzong's most famous romantic entanglement was with Yang Yuhuan, known to history as Yang Guifei. She wasn't just another concubine. She was originally married to his own son, which should have made her off-limits according to pretty much every moral code in existence. But Xuanzong decided that father-son relationships were less important than his personal happiness, so he forced his son to divorce her and then took her as his own favorite consort. That's not romance, that's appropriation with royal authority. Yang Guifei became Xuanzong's obsession. He built her private gardens, commissioned poets to write verses about her beauty, and reportedly spent entire days watching her dance. The emperor became so infatuated that he started making policy decisions based on her preferences. She liked a certain type of music. The imperial court would be restructured around it. She mentioned enjoying a particular kind of food. Entire agricultural regions would be devoted to producing it. At one point, Xuanzong allegedly ordered fresh lychees transported daily from southern China to the capital, a distance of over 1,000 miles, just because Yang Guifei had mentioned liking the fruit. The emperor's infatuation with Yang Guifei led to one of the most bizarre romantic gestures in imperial history. He built her a private hot spring resort in the mountains outside the capital, complete with marble pools, silk pavilions, and an artificial waterfall. The resort was staffed by hundreds of servants whose only job was to ensure Yang Guifei's comfort. Xuanzong would disappear to this mountain retreat for weeks at a time, leaving the empire to be run by his ministers while he played house with his favorite concubine. But Xuanzong's romantic obsessions had serious political consequences. Yang Guifei's family members were promoted to high positions they weren't qualified for, leading to corruption and incompetence throughout the government. Her cousin, Yang Guozhong, became chief minister despite having no administrative experience whatsoever. His primary qualification was being related to the emperor's girlfriend. This led to what historians call the Yang family problem, where imperial nepotism reached such absurd levels that competent officials were replaced by attractive relatives. The situation culminated in the Anlushan Rebellion of 755, one of the most devastating conflicts in Chinese history. Anlushan, a general who had also become infatuated with Yang Guifei, launched a massive rebellion, partly motivated by jealousy over the emperor's romantic monopoly. The rebellion lasted 8 years, killed millions of people, and permanently weakened the Tang dynasty. When Xuanzong was forced to flee the capital, his own soldiers demanded that Yang Guifei be executed, blaming her influence for the empire's disasters. Xuanzong reluctantly agreed, watching as the woman he'd obsessed over for decades was strangled by his own guards. Emperor Xuanzong's story is a classic example of how personal obsessions can destroy political legacies. He was a capable ruler who allowed romantic infatuation to cloud his judgment, leading to family scandals, government corruption, massive rebellion, and ultimately the decline of one of China's greatest dynasties, all because he couldn't keep his personal life separate from his imperial duties. Zhu Hojiao, known as Emperor Zhengde, ruled from 1505 to 1521 and approached imperial responsibilities with all the enthusiasm of a teenager forced to attend a family reunion. Instead of focusing on governance, Zhengde decided that being emperor was boring, and spent most of his reign trying to escape the palace for increasingly elaborate adventures in hedonism. Zhengde's first major scandal was his decision to build a second palace, which he called the Leopard Quarter, specifically designed for entertainment rather than administration. This wasn't a tasteful retreat, it was essentially a medieval party house, complete with artificial lakes for boating, elaborate gardens for picnicking, and private chambers designed for what court records describe as intimate entertainments. The Emperor stocked this pleasure palace with actors, musicians, dancers, and a rotating cast of women whose official job titles were deliberately vague. But what made Zhengde truly unusual was his habit of sneaking out of the imperial palace in disguise. He would dress as a commoner and wander through Beijing's entertainment districts, visiting brothels, taverns, and gambling houses. This wasn't the occasional rebellious night out. This was a systematic pattern of imperial truancy. Palace guards learned to search the city's red light districts whenever the emperor went missing, which happened several times per month. Zhengde's most notorious escapade involved his fascination with a courtesan named Liu Mirin, whose name literally meant Liu the Beautiful. She wasn't content to be a simple royal mistress. She was ambitious, intelligent, and reportedly more interested in political influence than romantic attention. Liu Mirin convinced Zhengde to appoint her friends and relatives to government positions, leading to what historians call the courtesan cabinet, where imperial policy was influenced by the recommendations of high-class prostitutes. The emperor's relationship with Liu Mirin became so scandalous that his own mother, Empress Dowager Wang, staged what was essentially a palace intervention. She had Liu Mirin arrested and executed, not for any specific crime, but simply for having too much influence over her son. Zhengde was devastated and reportedly spent weeks locked in his chambers, refusing to attend court sessions or sign official documents. The empire was essentially leaderless, while the emperor had what amounted to a royal emotional breakdown. But Zhengde's romantic adventures weren't limited to Beijing's entertainment districts. He developed a habit of inspecting provincial areas, which really meant traveling around China looking for new sources of amusement. During one inspection tour, he encountered a Muslim merchant's daughter in Taiyuan and decided he was in love. He extended his stay for months, living in the merchant's house and reportedly converting to Islam temporarily to win the family's approval. This created a diplomatic crisis, as Chinese emperors weren't supposed to change religions based on romantic interests. Zhengde's behavior became so erratic that his ministers began hiding important documents from him, fearing he would make impulsive decisions based on whatever woman he was currently infatuated with. At one point, court officials discovered that the emperor had been signing blank sheets of paper, which his current favourite would then fill in with whatever appointments or grants she wanted. This led to a situation where imperial edicts were being written by prostitutes and actresses, which is not how effective governance typically works. The emperor's escapist tendencies also included a bizarre fascination with military cosplay. He built a fake military camp in his palace gardens and would spend days pretending to be a common soldier, complete with sleeping on straw mats and eating simple meals. But even this military fantasy was corrupted by his romantic obsessions. The camp was staffed with attractive female soldiers who accompanied him on staged campaigns that usually ended in elaborate banquets and intimate celebrations. Zhengde's reign ended abruptly in 1521, when he died at age 29, possibly from the long-term effects of his excessive lifestyle. He left no heirs, having been too busy with recreational activities to focus on dynastic obligations. His death created a succession crisis that weakened the Ming dynasty for decades. He had spent 16 years demonstrating that absolute power without responsibility leads to absolute decadence, and that running an empire requires more than just an elaborate imagination and unlimited access to entertainment. Zhu Yijun, known as Emperor Wanli, ruled from 1572 to 1620 and spent most of his 48-year reign proving that you can govern an empire without ever leaving your bedroom, as long as your bedroom is large enough and well-staffed enough. Wanli's approach to imperial duties was essentially to delegate everything to his ministers, while he focused on what he considered the more important aspects of imperial life: his extensive collection of concubines and his elaborate personal rituals. Wanli's romantic life was notable not for its scandals, but for its sheer systematic thoroughness. He maintained detailed records of his encounters with different concubines, complete with dates, times, and what court documents euphemistically called outcomes. This wasn't passionate romance. This was bureaucratic procreation with imperial efficiency. The emperor treated his harem like a carefully managed agricultural operation, with specific schedules for different women and detailed tracking of results. The emperor's relationship with his favorite consort Zheng, became the defining romantic drama of his reign. Zheng wasn't just another beautiful woman in the imperial harem. She was politically ambitious and strategically minded. She convinced Wanli that their son should be named heir to the throne, bypassing the legitimate crown prince, who was the son of the Empress. This led to what historians call the succession controversy, where the emperor spent years refusing to officially name an heir because he was caught between dynastic law and personal preference. Wanli's obsession with consort Zheng led to increasingly bizarre attempts to elevate her status. He commissioned elaborate palaces for her exclusive use, appointed her relatives to high government positions, and even created new court titles specifically for her benefit. At one point, he attempted to have her retroactively declared Empress, which would have invalidated his existing Empress and created a constitutional crisis. His ministers spent years trying to talk him out of various romantic impulses that would have destabilized the entire imperial system. But what made Wanli truly unusual was his decision to govern the empire from his private quarters. For the last 20 years of his reign, he rarely appeared in public, conducting all imperial business through written communications and intermediaries. Court officials would submit documents to his palace staff, who would then present them to the emperor during his private time. This meant that imperial policy was being decided in a space that was essentially a combination throne room and brothel, with concubines present during official deliberations. The emperor's reclusive lifestyle led to some truly absurd bureaucratic situations. Important military decisions would be delayed for weeks because Wanli was busy with personal entertainments. Foreign ambassadors would wait months for audiences that never materialized. At one point, the imperial treasury ran out of funds partly because the emperor was too distracted to approve tax collection measures. The empire was essentially running on autopilot, while its leader focused on romantic management. Wanli's approach to imperial romance also included elaborate fantasy scenarios that consumed enormous resources. He commissioned court artists to create idealized portraits of his favorite concubines as various mythological figures. He staged elaborate theatrical productions where he and his chosen companions would act out classical love stories. One particularly expensive project involved building a replica of a famous romantic garden from literature, complete with artificial mountains, imported rare flowers, and trained birds that sang on command. The emperor's personal life became so complex that he employed specialized staff members just to manage his romantic calendar. Court records mention positions like coordinator of imperial companionship and scheduler of private audiences, which were essentially administrative roles dedicated to organizing the emperor's sex life. These positions came with official salaries, government housing, and bureaucratic rank, meaning that tax money was being used to fund what was essentially imperial dating management. Wanli's 48-year reign demonstrated that it's possible to maintain political power while completely abandoning political responsibility, as long as you have competent administrators and a stable system. But his romantic obsessions and reclusive behavior contributed to the Ming dynasty's gradual decline, as important decisions were delayed or ignored in favor of personal indulgences. He proved that an emperor could literally phone it in from his bedroom for decades, but also that such an approach eventually catches up with you. Ancien Zhulo Xuanye, known as Emperor Kangxi, ruled from 1661 to 1722, and approached imperial reproduction with the same systematic efficiency he brought to military campaigns and administrative reform. Kangxi wasn't particularly scandalous by Chinese imperial standards, but his sheer productivity in terms of generating offspring was so impressive that it deserves recognition as a form of imperial excess in its own right. Kangxi officially fathered 55 children with various wives and concubines, which averages out to nearly one child per year of his 61-year reign. This wasn't accidental. The emperor treated procreation as an imperial duty and approached it with methodical dedication. Court records show that he maintained detailed genealogical charts tracking bloodlines, birth dates, and the health status of all his offspring. it was dynasty management through sheer volume. The emperor's approach to managing his extensive family was essentially governmental. He established formal protocols for interacting with different categories of children, from potential heirs to daughters who would be married off for diplomatic purposes. Each child received specific education, housing, and allowances based on their position in the imperial hierarchy. Kangxi essentially ran a royal boarding school, with hundreds of students who all happened to be his biological offspring. What made Kangxi's reproductive career notable wasn't just the numbers, but his systematic approach to maternal selection. He chose concubines, not just for beauty or entertainment, but for what he considered genetic and political advantages. Some women were selected for their intelligence, others for their family connections, and still others for their health and presumed fertility. It was imperial breeding with strategic planning, like he was trying to optimize the next generation of the imperial line. The emperor's most challenging romantic situation involved the succession question. With so many sons, choosing an heir became incredibly complicated. Kangxi initially named his second son, Yinreng, as crown prince, but later changed his mind due to concerns about the young man's behavior and capabilities. This led to what historians call the Nine Princes Rebellion, where multiple sons began competing for imperial favor through increasingly elaborate demonstrations of filial piety and administrative competence. Kangxi's relationship management required sophisticated court protocols. Different concubines had specific days for imperial attention, organized according to rank, fertility status, and political considerations. The emperor's daily schedule included time blocks for official duties, military planning, cultural activities, and personal obligations to his various wives and concubines. His life was essentially a carefully choreographed rotation between governance and romance. The emperor's domestic arrangements became so complex that they required dedicated administrative staff. Palace records mention positions like coordinator of imperial schedules and manager of household harmony, which were essentially diplomatic roles designed to prevent conflicts between the emperor's various romantic interests. Court officials learned to navigate the political implications of imperial romantic attention, as favor or disfavor with different concubines could affect their own career prospects. Kangxi's prolific family life also created unique challenges for imperial protocol. With dozens of children reaching adulthood simultaneously, court ceremonies became logistical nightmares. Birthday celebrations, coming-of-age rituals, and marriage arrangements required months of planning and enormous resources. The emperor essentially spent as much time managing family events as governing the empire. But what's remarkable about Kangxi is that despite his extensive domestic obligations, he remained an effective ruler. He successfully expanded the Qing Empire, implemented important administrative reforms, and maintained political stability for over 6 decades. His ability to balance imperial duties with prolific family management suggests either exceptional organizational skills or a very competent administrative staff who could handle things while he was busy with personal obligations. Kangxi's reign demonstrates that imperial excess doesn't always lead to political dysfunction, as long as the excess is well organized and doesn't interfere with essential governance. His approach to reproduction was systematic rather than impulsive, strategic rather than purely indulgent. He treated his romantic life like another aspect of imperial administration, complete with protocols, hierarchies, and measurable outcomes. Yongyan, known as Emperor Jiaqing, ruled from 1796 to 1820 and spent most of his reign trying to clean up the imperial court's moral reputation, while simultaneously developing some peculiar romantic anxieties of his own. Jiaqing inherited the throne from his father, the prolific Emperor Qianlong, and seemed determined to prove that he could rule without the extensive romantic entanglements that had characterized previous emperors. Jiaqing's approach to imperial romance was notably restrained by traditional standards. He maintained a relatively small harem and showed little interest in acquiring new concubines or expanding his domestic arrangements. But what made his romantic life notable wasn't excess, but rather his obsessive concern with controlling and monitoring the romantic lives of everyone around him, from court officials to his own family members. The emperor developed what historians describe as romantic paranoia, a persistent fear that unauthorized romantic relationships among court members would somehow undermine imperial authority. He implemented elaborate surveillance systems to monitor interactions between male and female palace staff, requiring detailed reports on any signs of romantic interest or inappropriate behavior. Court officials learned to avoid even casual conversations with women, fearing that they might be misinterpreted as romantic advances. Jiaqing's suspicions extended to his own concubines and palace women. He established strict protocols governing their interactions with anyone outside the imperial family, including male servants, guards, and administrative staff. Women in the imperial household were essentially under house arrest, not as punishment, but as prevention. The emperor seemed convinced that romantic intrigue was constantly threatening imperial stability, even when no evidence of such intrigue existed. The emperor's romantic anxieties also affected his relationship with his own children. He subjected his sons to intensive moral education designed to prevent them from developing what he considered inappropriate romantic interests. Palace tutors were instructed to emphasize duty, restraint, and dynastic responsibility over personal happiness or romantic fulfillment. Jiaqing essentially tried to raise emotionally repressed heirs as a form of political stability. But Jiaqing's most notorious romantic decision involved his treatment of his father's concubines. When Emperor Qianlong died, traditional protocol required that his surviving concubines be maintained with appropriate respect and comfort. Instead, Jiaqing implemented what he called moral reform, systematically reducing their allowances, limiting their freedom, and essentially treating them as potential security threats. He seemed convinced that women who had been romantically involved with his father might somehow pose political dangers to his own reign. The emperor's paranoia reached absurd levels when he began investigating historical romantic relationships among court officials' families. He ordered background checks on the personal lives of ministers and administrators, looking for any evidence of adultery, inappropriate relationships, or romantic scandal that might indicate unreliable character. Career advancement became dependent not just on administrative competence, but on maintaining what the emperor considered appropriate personal behavior. Jiaqing's romantic control extended to marriage policies for court officials. He required detailed reports on proposed marriages within the imperial administration, including background investigations of potential spouses and their families. Officials learned to choose marriage partners based not on personal preference, but on what they thought the emperor would approve of. This led to a generation of strategically loveless marriages, designed to avoid imperial suspicion. The emperor's obsession with romantic control had serious political consequences. Court officials became reluctant to form any personal relationships that might attract imperial attention, leading to a sterile, paranoid atmosphere that discouraged genuine loyalty or emotional connection. The imperial court became a place where people were afraid to show human emotions, fearing that any sign of personal feeling might be interpreted as disloyalty or moral weakness. Despite his efforts to create a morally pure court, Jiaqing's reign was marked by increasing political instability, corruption, and rebellion. His obsessive focus on controlling romantic behavior distracted him from more serious governance issues like economic problems, administrative corruption, and military weakness. He proved that an emperor could be too concerned with moral purity for his own political good. Jiaqing's story demonstrates that imperial romantic excess can take different forms. While most emperors are remembered for having too many romantic relationships, Jiaqing is notable for his obsessive fear of romantic relationships in general. His paranoid approach to controlling imperial romance created an atmosphere of suspicion and repression that ultimately weakened rather than strengthened his political authority. A Sinjuoro Yiju, known as Emperor Xianfeng, ruled from 1850 to 1861 during one of the most turbulent periods in Chinese history, and his response to national crisis was essentially to retreat into elaborate romantic fantasies involving opium, opera singers, and an astonishing level of political denial. While the Qing Empire faced foreign invasion, massive rebellion, and administrative collapse, Xianfeng decided that the imperial palace should function as a combination opium den and entertainment complex. Xianfeng's most notorious romantic relationship was with an opera singer known as Su Shun, though that might have been a stage name designed to protect her real identity. Su Shun wasn't just the emperor's mistress. She was essentially his drugs and entertainment coordinator, managing a complex operation that kept the emperor supplied with opium, romantic companionship, and theatrical performances that helped him avoid dealing with the collapse of his empire. The emperor's daily routine during the later years of his reign involved what court officials euphemistically called extended recreational periods. These weren't simple relaxation sessions, they were elaborate, drug-fueled romantic scenarios that could last for days. Xianfeng would retreat to specially prepared chambers with multiple female companions, supplies of high-quality opium, and musical entertainment, emerging only when forced to deal with the most urgent imperial business. But Xianfeng's romantic arrangements weren't just about personal pleasure. They served as his primary coping mechanism for the overwhelming stress of ruling a disintegrating empire. While the Taiping Rebellion raged across southern China, killing millions of people, the emperor was hosting elaborate costume parties where he and his concubines would dress as characters from classical literature and act out romantic scenes from traditional operas. It was escapism on an imperial scale. The emperor's relationship with consort Yi, who would later become the famous Empress Dowager Cixi, began as another one of his recreational romantic arrangements, but evolved into something more politically significant. Consort Yi was intelligent, ambitious, and crucially, willing to manage the practical aspects of imperial administration, while Xianfeng focused on his various personal entertainments. She essentially became his chief of staff, with benefits, handling correspondence, appointments, and policy decisions, while he remained occupied with opium and opera singers. Xianfeng's romantic lifestyle required increasingly elaborate logistical support. Palace records mention specialized staff positions like keeper of imperial recreational supplies and coordinator of private entertainment, which were essentially drug dealers and party planners with official court titles. The emperor's recreational needs consumed significant imperial resources, including rare opium varieties, imported musical instruments, and custom-designed furniture for various romantic scenarios. The emperor's opium-fueled romantic sessions often included what court historians describe as creative interpretations of classical literature. Xianfeng would stage elaborate performances of romantic scenes from famous novels and plays, with himself and his concubines taking leading roles. These productions required elaborate costumes, sets, and scripts, essentially turning the imperial palace into a private theatre dedicated to the emperor's romantic fantasies. But Xianfeng's most bizarre romantic arrangement involved his attempt to recreate famous historical love stories within the palace. He commissioned detailed replicas of legendary gardens, pavilions, and settings from classical romance literature, then staged reenactments with his concubines playing various historical romantic figures. One particularly expensive project involved building a replica of the legendary peach blossom spring, complete with artificial mountains, imported peach trees, and trained animals, where the emperor could live out pastoral romantic fantasies while his empire burned. The emperor's romantic escapism had serious military and political consequences. Foreign powers found it relatively easy to defeat Qing forces, partly because imperial leadership was distracted by recreational activities. The Second Opium War succeeded partly because the emperor was too busy consuming opium to effectively coordinate military resistance. His romantic retreat strategy essentially handed military advantage to his enemies. Xianfeng's death in 1861 at age 30 was likely accelerated by his excessive lifestyle, including heavy opium use and the physical demands of his elaborate romantic arrangements. He left behind a weakened empire, a power struggle between his concubines, and a legacy demonstrating that some forms of imperial romance are really just elaborate suicide methods with better interior decorating. His reign shows how imperial romantic excess can serve as a form of political paralysis. Instead of using absolute power to address serious challenges, Xianfeng used it to create an elaborate fantasy world where he could avoid dealing with reality. His romantic arrangements weren't expressions of passion or political strategy. They were sophisticated forms of imperial procrastination that cost his empire dearly. A Sinjiro Zetian, known as Emperor Guangxu, ruled from 1875 to 1908, and represents one of history's most tragic examples of how romantic relationships can become entangled with political reform movements, foreign influence, and family power struggles. Guangxu's romantic life was shaped by his position as a puppet emperor controlled by his aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi, who used his personal relationships as tools for maintaining her own political power. Guangxu's most significant romantic relationship was with his wife Empress Longyu, who was chosen for him by Empress Dowager Cixi, specifically because she was Cixi's niece and could be trusted to report on the emperor's activities. This wasn't a marriage based on personal compatibility or political alliance. It was essentially a surveillance arrangement disguised as imperial romance. Long Yu was instructed to monitor her husband's conversations, correspondence and daily activities, reporting anything suspicious back to Cixi. But the emperor's real romantic attachment was to the pearl consort, Zhengde, an intelligent and politically minded young woman who shared Guangxu's interest in modernizing China. Zhengde wasn't content to be a passive imperial concubine. She encouraged the emperor's reform efforts, supported his attempts to modernize Chinese government and military, and reportedly helped him correspond with foreign advisors about political and social change. Their relationship combined genuine romantic attraction with shared political goals. Guangxu and Zhengde's partnership represented something new in Chinese imperial history, a romantic relationship based on intellectual and political compatibility rather than traditional dynastic considerations. They spent hours discussing Western political philosophy, modern science, and social reform. Court observers noted that the emperor seemed more animated and engaged when speaking with Zhengde than during official court sessions. Their romance was essentially a political alliance disguised as a love affair. But Empress Dowager Cixi viewed Guangxu's relationship with Zhengde as a direct threat to her political control. Zhengde's influence over the emperor was encouraging his independence and supporting his reform efforts, which challenged Cixi's traditional conservative policies. The romantic relationship was becoming a vehicle for political opposition, which made it dangerous from Cixi's perspective. The conflict came to a head during the 100 Days Reform of 1898, when Guangxu attempted to implement sweeping modernization policies with Zhengde's encouragement and support. Cixi responded by staging a palace coup, placing the emperor under house arrest and systematically destroying his reform movement. As part of her crackdown, she had Zhengde imprisoned and eventually executed, ending both the romantic relationship and the political partnership it represented. Guangxu's romantic tragedy was that his most meaningful relationship was also politically threatening to the power structure that controlled him. His love for Zhengde represented his desire for personal autonomy and political independence, making it inevitable that the relationship would be destroyed by those who wanted to maintain their control over him. The romance became a casualty of larger political conflicts over modernization and reform. After Zhengde's death, Guangxu became increasingly withdrawn and depressed. Court observers noted that he seemed broken, showing little interest in imperial duties, personal relationships, or even basic self-care. His remaining years were spent in what amounted to comfortable imprisonment, monitored by his wife, who reported to his aunt, surrounded by people who viewed his happiness as politically dangerous. The emperor's romantic life also included several attempts by Cixi to control his behavior through arranged relationships. She provided him with concubines who were specifically chosen for their loyalty to her rather than their compatibility with him. These relationships were essentially honey traps designed to keep the emperor occupied while preventing him from forming genuine emotional connections that might encourage independence. Guangxu's story demonstrates how imperial romance can become a battlefield for larger political conflicts. His relationship with Zhengde represented his desire for modernization, independence, and personal fulfillment, which made it a threat to conservative forces who wanted to maintain traditional power structures. The romantic relationship was destroyed not because it was scandalous or inappropriate, but because it was politically empowering. The emperor's death in 1908, just one day before Empress Dowager Cixi's death, has led to speculation that he was poisoned to prevent him from regaining power after her death. His romantic tragedy thus became part of a larger political tragedy, representing the failure of Chinese attempts at modernization and reform during this crucial period in Chinese history. Guangxu's reign shows how imperial romance can become entangled with broader historical forces like modernization, foreign influence, and generational change. His love story with Zhengde was also a story about China's struggle to adapt to the modern world, making it both personally tragic and historically significant. To understand the romantic excesses of Chinese emperors, it's essential to examine the institutional framework that made such behavior possible: the imperial concubine system. This wasn't simply a matter of powerful men collecting beautiful women. It was a sophisticated bureaucratic structure designed to manage imperial reproduction, political alliances, and court hierarchy through systematized romantic relationships. The concubine system operated on multiple levels, with elaborate rankings that determined everything from housing assignments to clothing allowances. At the top were the official wives and highest-ranking consorts, who lived in dedicated palaces with their own staff and administrative responsibilities. Below them were various grades of concubines, each with specific titles, duties, and privileges. At the bottom were palace ladies and servants, who might occasionally attract imperial attention, but had no official romantic status. Imperial concubine selection was a complex process that combined beauty contests with political calculation. Families would present daughters for imperial consideration, but selection depended on factors like regional representation, family connections, and perceived genetic advantages. The goal wasn't just to provide the emperor with attractive companionship, but to create a diverse collection of potential mothers for imperial heirs who would represent different geographic regions and political interests. The daily management of hundreds or thousands of concubines required extensive administrative support. Palace records show positions like Director of Imperial Companionship, Scheduler of Romantic Audiences, and Coordinator of Concubine Affairs. These weren't ceremonial titles, they were working administrative positions with real responsibilities for managing what was essentially a city-sized dating operation with imperial authority. The economic impact of the concubine system was staggering. Maintaining thousands of women in appropriate luxury required enormous resources. Concubines needed housing, clothing, food, entertainment, medical care, and servants. Higher-ranking consorts received allowances that exceeded the annual budgets of entire provinces. The imperial treasury was essentially funding a parallel economy dedicated to romantic logistics. Competition within the concubine system created its own political dynamics. Women competed not just for imperial attention, but for advancement in the court hierarchy. This competition included everything from elaborate gift-giving to behind-the-scenes alliance building to occasional assassination attempts. The imperial harem was essentially a combination sorority house and political battlefield, with romantic success determining access to power and resources. The concubine system also served diplomatic functions. Foreign kingdoms would send their most beautiful daughters as tributes, creating romantic relationships that doubled as international alliances. An emperor's choice of which foreign concubines to favor could influence trade agreements, military cooperation, and territorial negotiations. Imperial romance was thus a form of soft diplomacy conducted through bedroom politics. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the concubine system was its bureaucratic sophistication. Court officials maintained detailed records of imperial romantic encounters, tracking everything from frequency of visits to pregnancy outcomes. These records were used for scheduling purposes, inheritance decisions, and political planning. Imperial romance was documented with the same precision as tax collection or military campaigns. Imperial romance was documented with the same precision as tax collection or military campaigns. The system created unique career opportunities for women who understood how to navigate its complexities. Successful concubines could gain enormous influence over imperial policy, accumulate significant wealth, and secure powerful positions for their families. Some concubines essentially functioned as unofficial ministers, using their romantic access to the emperor to influence government decisions. However, the concubine system also created serious problems. The enormous cost drained imperial resources that could have been used for infrastructure, military defense, or social programs. The political competition within harems sometimes destabilized court administration, and the system's emphasis on reproductive success over other qualifications meant that imperial policy was sometimes influenced by people chosen primarily for their physical attractiveness rather than their political wisdom. The concubine system demonstrates how imperial romantic excess was not simply a matter of personal indulgence, but a complex institutional structure that affected economics, politics, diplomacy, and social organization. Understanding this system helps explain how individual emperors' romantic decisions could have such far-reaching consequences for their empires and their people. While most of our focus has been on male emperors and their romantic excesses, no discussion of imperial Chinese sexuality would be complete without examining Cixi, who demonstrated that women could also use romantic relationships as tools for accumulating and maintaining political power. Cixi's rise from concubine to de facto ruler of China represents one of history's most successful examples of strategic romantic positioning. Cixi began her imperial career as a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Xianfeng, selected primarily for her beauty and family connections. But unlike many imperial concubines who remained passive recipients of imperial attention, Cixi understood that romantic access to the emperor could be leveraged into political influence. She made herself indispensable, not just as a romantic companion, but as an administrative assistant who could handle correspondence and manage imperial scheduling. The key to Cixi's success was her ability to combine romantic manipulation with genuine administrative competence. While other concubines focused on maintaining their physical attractiveness and competing for imperial attention, Cixi learned to read, write, and understand government operations. She became the person Emperor Xianfeng relied on, not just for personal companionship, but for help managing the overwhelming responsibilities of imperial administration during a period of national crisis. Cixi's romantic relationship with Xianfeng was strategic rather than passionate. She understood that the emperor was overwhelmed by the challenges of governing during the Taiping Rebellion and the Second Opium War, and she positioned herself as someone who could provide both emotional support and practical assistance. This combination made her far more valuable than concubines who offered only physical attractiveness or entertainment. When Cixi gave birth to Xianfeng's son in 1856, she secured her position within the imperial hierarchy. But rather than simply resting on her success as the mother of a potential heir, she continued building her political network and administrative knowledge. She understood that romantic success, without political understanding, would leave her vulnerable to court intrigue and power struggles. After Xianfeng's death in 1861, Cixi faced the challenge of maintaining power despite having no official political authority. As a concubine and mother of the heir, she had no constitutional right to rule. But she had built relationships with key court officials, understood government operations, and possessed the administrative skills necessary to manage imperial affairs. She essentially staged a slow-motion coup that transformed her from imperial concubine to imperial ruler. Cixi's approach to maintaining power involved carefully managing the romantic and political relationships of everyone around her. She arranged marriages for court officials, selected concubines for the emperors who succeeded Xianfeng, and monitored the personal relationships of anyone who might pose a political threat. She understood that controlling other people's romantic lives was a form of political control. The Empress Dowager's management of Emperor Guangxu's romantic relationships demonstrates her sophisticated understanding of how personal relationships intersect with political power. When Guangxu's relationship with the Pearl Consort began encouraging his independence and reform efforts, Cixi recognized it as a political threat and systematically destroyed it. She understood that romantic relationships could be vehicles for political opposition. Cixi's own romantic life, after becoming Empress Dowager, remained somewhat mysterious, but court observers noted that she maintained close relationships with several male officials who seemed to have unusual access to her private quarters. Whether these relationships were romantic, political, or some combination of both, they demonstrate her continued understanding that personal relationships were tools for maintaining political control. Throughout her decades in power, Cixi demonstrated that strategic romantic positioning could be more effective than traditional political methods for acquiring and maintaining authority. She rose from powerless concubine to effective ruler of China through a combination of romantic manipulation, administrative competence, and political ruthlessness. Her success shows that imperial romance could be a pathway to power for those clever enough to understand its potential. Cixi's story also demonstrates the limitations of romantic-based political power. Her authority was always somewhat unofficial and dependent on personal relationships, rather than institutional legitimacy. This made her rule effective in some ways, but also unstable and difficult to transfer to successors. When she died in 1908, the political system she had created through romantic manipulation died with her. The Empress Dowager's career represents the ultimate expression of imperial romance as political strategy. She understood that in a system where personal access to power was often more important than official titles or constitutional authority, romantic relationships could be leveraged into genuine political control. Her success changed Chinese history and demonstrated that sexual politics could be just as powerful as traditional politics when wielded by someone who understood the game. No examination of imperial Chinese romance would be complete without discussing the eunuchs, whose presence in the imperial court created a unique dynamic where men who were surgically prevented from having romantic relationships often became some of the most powerful figures in imperial administration. The eunuch system represents one of history's most extreme examples of using sexual control as a tool for political organization. Imperial eunuchs were men who had been castrated, either as children or adults, specifically to serve in roles that required close contact with imperial women without the possibility of romantic or sexual relationships. This wasn't a voluntary career choice for most eunuchs. Many were sold into the system by impoverished families, while others were forced into castration as punishment for crimes or political opposition. The logic behind the eunuch system was straightforward. The imperial harem contained hundreds or thousands of women who were considered the emperor's exclusive romantic property. But managing such a large population of women required extensive male administrative and support staff. Eunuchs provided a solution by creating a class of men who could work closely with imperial women without posing any threat to the emperor's romantic monopoly. But the eunuch system created its own complex dynamics. Eunuchs often developed intense emotional relationships with imperial concubines, relationships that were romantic in every way except the physical. These relationships could be just as jealous, manipulative, and politically significant as traditional romantic relationships, but they operated within different constraints and possibilities. Some eunuchs became essentially romantic advisors to imperial concubines, helping them navigate court politics, manage their appearance and behavior, and compete for imperial attention. These relationships often involved deep emotional intimacy and mutual dependence. Eunuchs provided emotional support and practical assistance to women who were otherwise isolated within the imperial harem, while concubines provided eunuchs with access to imperial influence and protection. The most successful eunuchs understood how to leverage their unique position within the imperial romantic system. Because they posed no sexual threat, they could often gain access to both male and female court members in ways that intact men could not. They became conduits for information, alliance building, and political maneuvering that crossed gender lines within the highly segregated imperial court. Eunuchs also developed their own internal hierarchies and power structures that sometimes rivaled or even exceeded the influence of traditional court officials. Senior eunuchs could control access to the emperor, manage imperial schedules, and influence policy decisions through their administrative roles. Some eunuchs accumulated enormous wealth and political influence, essentially becoming shadow rulers who operated behind the scenes of official imperial government. The relationship between eunuchs and imperial romance was complex and often contradictory. While eunuchs were prevented from having traditional romantic relationships, they often became intensely involved in managing and manipulating the romantic relationships of others. They served as matchmakers, spies, messengers, and advisors in the complex web of relationships that surrounded imperial romance. Some eunuchs developed what could only be described as romantic obsessions with particular emperors or empresses, relationships that involved deep emotional attachment despite the absence of physical intimacy. These relationships could be just as jealous and possessive as traditional romantic relationships, and they sometimes had significant political consequences when eunuchs used their influence to advance the interests of their favored imperial figures. The eunuch system also created opportunities for deception and manipulation that complicated imperial romance. Because eunuchs were assumed to be sexually harmless, they sometimes served as covers for illicit romantic relationships or as intermediaries for secret communications between people who were not supposed to have contact with each other. The most powerful eunuchs understood how to use their position within the imperial romantic system to accumulate political influence that extended far beyond the palace walls. They could influence military appointments, tax policies, and foreign relations by leveraging their access to imperial decision-makers and their understanding of the personal relationships that shaped imperial politics. The eunuch system demonstrates how imperial attempts to control sexuality often created new forms of sexual and romantic complexity. By creating a class of men who were surgically prevented from having traditional romantic relationships, The imperial court actually created new types of relationships that were sometimes even more politically significant than the traditional romantic relationships they were designed to prevent. The presence of eunuchs in the imperial court also meant that romantic relationships operated within a context where sexuality and power were constantly being negotiated and redefined. Eunuchs served as living reminders that sexual control was a form of political control, and their presence shaped how everyone else in the court understood and navigated romantic relationships. Chinese imperial romantic culture produced an enormous body of poetry, literature, and artistic expression that provides insight into how emperors and their romantic partners understood and rationalized their relationships. This literary tradition reveals that imperial romance was not just about physical gratification or political maneuvering, but also about cultural expression and intellectual engagement. Many Chinese emperors were accomplished poets who wrote extensively about their romantic relationships, creating a literary tradition that combined political authority with personal expression. These imperial love poems were not private documents. They were often shared at court, circulated among officials, and preserved in imperial archives as part of the official historical record. Emperor Xuanzong of Tang, despite his problematic obsession with Yang Guifei, was also a sophisticated poet who wrote extensively about his romantic experiences. His poems about Yang Guifei are considered masterpieces of Chinese love poetry, combining genuine emotional expression with elaborate literary technique. These poems reveal that Xuanzong understood his romantic obsession as both personally fulfilling and artistically inspiring. The tradition of imperial romantic poetry served multiple functions within court culture. It provided emperors with a socially acceptable way to express personal emotions that might otherwise be considered politically inappropriate. It demonstrated imperial cultural sophistication and artistic patronage, and it created a literary framework for understanding romantic relationships as expressions of refined sentiment rather than simple physical indulgence. Imperial concubines also participated in this literary tradition, creating poems and essays about their experiences within the imperial harem. These works provide rare insights into how women within the imperial romantic system understood their own situations and relationships. Some concubine poetry expresses genuine romantic sentiment, while other works reveal the political calculations and competitive dynamics that shaped imperial romantic relationships. The literary tradition also includes elaborate fictional narratives about imperial romance, stories that often served as coded commentary on contemporary court politics. These fictional accounts allowed authors to explore the tensions and contradictions within imperial romantic culture while maintaining plausible deniability about any specific political criticism. Court poets and writers, who were not directly involved in imperial romantic relationships, also contributed to this literary tradition, creating works that celebrated, criticized, or analyzed imperial romantic culture. These outside perspectives provide valuable insights into how imperial romantic excess was understood and judged by contemporary observers. The artistic tradition surrounding imperial romance extended beyond poetry to include painting, music, and theatrical performance. Imperial romantic relationships inspired elaborate artistic productions that were performed at court and preserved as cultural artifacts. These artistic works reveal how imperial romance was understood as a source of cultural inspiration as well as political controversy. Some of the most famous works in Chinese literature emerged from or were inspired by imperial romantic relationships. The story of Emperor Xuanzong and Yang Guifei became the subject of countless poems, plays, and novels that continue to be read and performed today. These literary works have shaped how Chinese culture understands the relationship between love, power, and political responsibility. The literary tradition also reveals the tensions between Confucian moral ideals and imperial romantic practice. Many imperial romantic poems express guilt, regret, or moral ambivalence about the contradiction between personal desires and political duties. These works show that emperors were often aware of the moral and political problems created by their romantic excess, even when they were unwilling or unable to change their behavior. The preservation of this literary tradition in imperial archives demonstrates that romantic relationships were considered legitimate subjects for historical documentation and cultural expression. Imperial romance was not hidden or denied, but rather celebrated and analysed as an important aspect of imperial culture and political life. The poetic tradition surrounding imperial romance also influenced how later generations understood and interpreted these historical relationships. Modern Chinese understanding of figures like Yang Guifei or consort Zheng is shaped as much by centuries of poetry and literature as by historical documentation. The romantic relationships themselves became cultural symbols that transcended their original historical context. The financial cost of imperial romantic excess represents one of the most overlooked aspects of Chinese imperial history. The resources devoted to maintaining elaborate harems, building romantic palaces, and supporting the complex bureaucracy of imperial romance often exceeded the costs of military campaigns or major infrastructure projects. Imperial harems required enormous ongoing expenses that drained imperial treasuries for centuries. Each concubine needed appropriate housing, clothing, food, servants, and entertainment. Higher-ranking consorts received allowances that could support entire villages. The cumulative cost of maintaining thousands of women in imperial luxury represented a significant portion of total government expenditure. The construction costs associated with imperial romance were equally staggering. Emperors like Yang of Sui and Kangxi spent fortunes building specialized palaces, gardens, and entertainment complexes designed specifically for romantic activities. These projects required massive labor forces, expensive materials, and ongoing maintenance that continued long after the original romantic relationships had ended. Palace records from various dynasties show line items for romantic expenses that included everything from imported perfumes and exotic foods to specialized furniture and custom-made clothing. The imperial court employed hundreds of craftsmen, artists, and servants whose primary job was to support imperial romantic activities. These employment costs represented a significant drain on government resources. The indirect economic costs of imperial romantic excess were even more substantial. When emperors were distracted by romantic activities, important economic policies were delayed or ignored. Trade negotiations suffered when imperial attention was focused on personal relationships rather than commercial interests. Agricultural and infrastructure projects were postponed or cancelled to fund romantic expenditures. Some dynasties faced serious financial crises that were directly linked to imperial romantic expenses. The cost of maintaining elaborate harems during periods of military conflict or natural disaster diverted resources from essential government functions. Imperial romance became a luxury that impoverished empires could not afford, but emperors seemed unable to abandon. The economic impact extended to imperial families and court officials who were expected to provide gifts and financial support for imperial romantic activities. Court positions became expensive to maintain because officials were constantly pressured to contribute to imperial romantic expenses through gifts, entertainments, and financial contributions. Regional governments also felt the economic pressure of imperial romance through taxation and resource extraction designed to support court expenses. Provinces were required to provide tribute that included luxury goods, exotic foods, and beautiful women for imperial harems. These demands created additional economic burdens for local populations already struggling with regular taxation. The international economic impact of imperial romantic excess affected trade relationships and diplomatic exchanges. Foreign kingdoms that wanted to maintain good relations with China were expected to provide tribute that included luxury goods and beautiful women for imperial harems. These expectations shaped international trade and diplomatic relationships in ways that sometimes conflicted with broader economic interests. Some emperors attempted to justify romantic expenses as necessary for maintaining imperial prestige and demonstrating imperial power. They argued that elaborate harems and romantic displays showed foreign visitors and domestic subjects that the Chinese Empire was wealthy and sophisticated. Whether this cultural diplomacy was worth its enormous cost remains debatable. The economic analysis of imperial romance also reveals interesting patterns in how different dynasties prioritized romantic expenditures versus other government expenses. Some dynasties maintained relatively modest romantic establishments while investing heavily in military and infrastructure projects. Others essentially bankrupted themselves maintaining elaborate romantic bureaucracies. Modern economic historians have attempted to calculate the total cost of imperial romantic excess across Chinese history, but the calculations are complicated by incomplete records and the difficulty of translating ancient currency values into modern equivalents. However, available evidence suggests that the cumulative cost was enormous, representing perhaps the largest sustained luxury expenditure in human history. The economic legacy of imperial romantic excess also influenced how later Chinese governments understood the relationship between personal indulgence and political responsibility. The awareness that imperial romance could bankrupt empires became part of Chinese political culture, influencing how subsequent rulers balanced personal desires with fiscal responsibility. The relationship between imperial romantic excess and dynastic collapse represents one of the most consistent patterns in Chinese history. While no dynasty fell solely because of romantic scandal, imperial romantic excess often served as both a symptom and a cause of the political dysfunction that led to dynastic collapse. The pattern typically began with emperors, who inherited stable, prosperous empires, but gradually became more interested in personal pleasure than political responsibility. As these emperors devoted increasing time and resources to romantic activities, essential government functions suffered, military preparedness declined, economic policies were neglected, and administrative competence deteriorated. The Sui dynasty's collapse provides a clear example of this pattern. Emperor Yang's obsession with building pleasure palaces and maintaining enormous harems diverted resources from military defense and infrastructure maintenance. When rebellions began erupting across the empire, Yang was too distracted by romantic activities to respond effectively. His romantic excess had weakened the empire to the point where it could not defend itself against determined opposition. Similar patterns appeared throughout Chinese history. The Tang dynasty's decline accelerated during Emperor Xuanzong's obsession with Yang Guifei, when imperial romantic preoccupation contributed to the conditions that enabled the devastating Anlushan rebellion. The Ming dynasty's weakness during Emperor Wanli's reign was partly attributed to his reclusive lifestyle and romantic obsessions that prevented effective governance. The relationship between romantic excess and dynastic collapse was not simply a matter of resource allocation. Imperial romantic obsessions often created political instability by encouraging factional conflicts, succession crises, and administrative corruption. When emperors made political decisions based on romantic preferences rather than governmental competence, the quality of imperial administration declined rapidly. Foreign enemies often exploited the weaknesses created by imperial romantic excess. Military campaigns failed when emperors were too distracted to provide effective leadership. Diplomatic negotiations suffered when imperial attention was focused on personal relationships rather than international affairs. Trade and economic policies deteriorated when romantic activities took precedence over commercial interests. The psychological impact of imperial romantic excess on court culture also contributed to dynastic decline. When emperors openly prioritized personal pleasure over political responsibility, court officials often followed similar patterns of behavior. Administrative corruption increased as officials focused on personal enrichment rather than public service. Military discipline declined as commanders prioritized comfort over preparedness. Public perception of imperial romantic excess also played a role in dynastic collapse. When common people understood that their rulers were spending enormous resources on personal pleasure while ignoring public welfare, popular support for the dynasty eroded. Rebellions often gained momentum by contrasting imperial luxury with popular suffering. The succession problems created by imperial romantic excess frequently destabilized dynasties during vulnerable transition periods. When emperors died leaving unclear succession arrangements due to complex romantic relationships, the resulting power struggles weakened imperial authority and created opportunities for domestic rebellion and foreign invasion. Some dynasties attempted to prevent romantic excess from contributing to their decline by implementing institutional controls on imperial behavior. The Qing dynasty's relatively long survival was partly attributed to their more systematic approach to managing imperial romance within acceptable limits. However, even the Qing eventually succumbed to problems partly related to romantic excess and political dysfunction. The historical pattern of romantic excess contributing to dynastic decline, became part of Chinese political culture, influencing how subsequent rulers understood the relationship between personal behavior and political responsibility. The awareness that romantic excess could destroy empires served as a cautionary influence on some emperors, though many continue to repeat the same patterns despite historical warnings. Modern historians debate whether imperial romantic excess was primarily a cause or a symptom of dynastic decline. The evidence suggests it was both. Political weakness encouraged emperors to retreat into romantic fantasy, while romantic excess further weakened their ability to address the challenges that threatened their empires. The relationship was cyclical and self-reinforcing, creating a downward spiral that often ended in dynastic collapse. The analysis of how romantic excess contributed to dynastic collapse also reveals the importance of institutional controls on imperial behavior. Dynasties that developed effective mechanisms for limiting imperial romantic excess or preventing it from interfering with essential government functions tended to survive longer than those that allowed emperors unlimited romantic freedom. And so we reach the end of our journey through the bedrooms, banquet halls, and pleasure palaces of imperial China, where absolute power met absolutely no self-control, and the results were as predictable as they were spectacular. From Emperor Yang's floating brothels to Cixi's strategic romantic maneuvering, we've explored how imperial romance shaped Chinese history in ways that were sometimes profound, often absurd, and always expensive. The stories we've examined tonight reveal that imperial romantic excess was never simply about personal indulgence. It was a complex intersection of politics, economics, culture, and power that affected millions of people across centuries of Chinese history. When emperors made romantic decisions, they were also making political decisions that could determine the fate of empires. What emerges from these historical accounts is a pattern of how unlimited power corrupts judgment in deeply human ways. These emperors had access to resources and authority that most people can barely imagine, but they used that power to pursue the same basic human desires for companionship, pleasure, and emotional satisfaction that drive ordinary people. The difference was that their personal mistakes had empire-wide consequences. The institutional structures that enabled imperial romantic excess, from the elaborate concubine systems to the armies of eunuchs and administrative staff, demonstrate how political systems can evolve to support and rationalize fundamentally dysfunctional behavior. These weren't accidental developments, they were carefully designed bureaucratic innovations created specifically to manage imperial romantic excess on an industrial scale. The economic costs of imperial romance were staggering, representing perhaps the largest sustained luxury expenditure in human history. The resources devoted to maintaining harems, building pleasure palaces, and supporting romantic bureaucracies could have built cities, funded armies, or supported entire populations. Instead, they were consumed by a relatively small number of people pursuing personal gratification. The cultural legacy of imperial romantic excess is equally significant. These relationships inspired some of the greatest works in Chinese literature and art, while also serving as cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked power. The stories of emperors and their romantic partners became part of Chinese cultural identity, shaping how subsequent generations understood the relationship between love, power, and responsibility. Perhaps most importantly, these historical accounts reveal the deeply human nature of political power. Despite their exalted status and enormous authority, these emperors were driven by the same emotions, desires, and psychological needs that affect everyone. Their stories remind us that political leaders are fundamentally human, with all the weaknesses and irrationalities that humanity entails. The patterns we've examined also demonstrate the importance of institutional constraints on political power. The dynasties that developed effective mechanisms for controlling imperial excess tended to survive longer than those that allowed unlimited personal freedom to their rulers. This suggests that sustainable political systems require checks and balances, not just on official authority, but on personal behavior as well. The international implications of imperial romantic excess also shaped Chinese relationships with neighboring kingdoms and foreign powers. When Chinese emperors were distracted by personal relationships, their empires became vulnerable to external threats and internal rebellion. Imperial romance thus became a factor in international relations and military history, as well as domestic politics. The gender dynamics revealed in these stories show how imperial romantic excess affected not just emperors and their partners, but entire social systems. The concubine system created opportunities for some women to gain enormous influence and wealth, while simultaneously oppressing and exploiting thousands of others. It demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of using romantic relationships as pathways to power. The technological and logistical achievements required to support imperial romantic excess were remarkable in their own right. The ability to maintain harems of thousands of people, coordinate complex romantic schedules, and build elaborate pleasure complexes represented significant organizational and engineering capabilities. These same capabilities could have been used for other purposes, but were instead devoted to supporting imperial romantic activities. The medical and health implications of imperial romantic excess are largely undocumented in historical records, but must have been significant. The physical and psychological demands of maintaining relationships with hundreds or thousands of partners, combined with the stress of political responsibility and the effects of luxury consumption, likely contributed to the relatively short lifespans of many Chinese emperors. The religious and philosophical tensions created by imperial romantic excess also shaped Chinese intellectual development. The contradiction between Confucian ideals of moral leadership and the reality of imperial romantic behavior created ongoing debates about the nature of political authority and personal responsibility that influenced Chinese philosophy for centuries. Looking at these historical patterns from a modern perspective, it's tempting to judge these emperors harshly for their excesses and poor judgment. But their stories also reveal the universal human struggle to balance personal desires with public responsibilities, a challenge that continues to affect political leaders today. The scale and consequences were different, but the fundamental tensions remain the same. The preservation of these stories in Chinese historical records also demonstrates a remarkable commitment to documenting uncomfortable truths about imperial behavior. Despite the potential embarrassment and political sensitivity of these accounts, Chinese historians continue to record and preserve detailed information about imperial romantic excess, creating an invaluable historical resource. The psychological profiles that emerge from these historical accounts suggest that imperial romantic excess often served as a coping mechanism for the overwhelming stress and isolation of absolute power. Many of these emperors seem to use romantic relationships as escapes from the burden of political responsibility, creating elaborate fantasy worlds where they could temporarily forget the challenges of governing vast empires. The international scholarly community has increasingly recognized the importance of studying imperial romantic excess as a factor in Chinese historical development. These relationships were not merely personal scandals, but significant historical forces that shaped political, economic, and cultural development across centuries of Chinese civilization. As we close tonight's exploration of imperial Chinese romance, we're left with a complex picture of how personal relationships intersected with political power in ways that were sometimes creative, often destructive, and always consequential. These emperors wielded absolute authority over vast empires, but they remained fundamentally human in their desires, weaknesses, and need for connection. Their stories serve as both entertainment and education, reminding us that history is shaped by human beings with all their complexities, contradictions, and capacity for both greatness and folly. The emperors we've discussed tonight left behind legacies that were measured not just in military victories or cultural achievements, but in the ruins of pleasure palaces and the echoes of romantic scandals that reverberated through Chinese history. And with that sobering reflection on the intersection of power, passion, and political responsibility, we conclude tonight's journey through the most intimate chambers of imperial Chinese history. Sweet dreams, and remember, absolute power corrupts absolutely, but it also makes for absolutely fascinating historical documentation. The stories we've shared tonight remind us that behind every great empire, there were real people making personal decisions that affected millions of lives. Sometimes those decisions were wise, sometimes foolish, but they were always deeply human. And in their humanity, perhaps we can find both warning and wisdom for our own times. Sleep well, history enthusiasts. May your dreams be filled with less dynastic drama and more imperial wisdom than the emperors we've met tonight. But before we let you drift off completely, let's take a moment to examine something truly fascinating: The sheer bureaucratic thoroughness with which Chinese imperial courts documented their rulers' romantic excesses. These weren't scandalous rumours or gossip passed down through generations. These were official court records, maintained by armies of scribes whose job it was to document every aspect of imperial life, including the most intimate details. The imperial secretaries who maintained these records developed elaborate systems for categorizing and tracking romantic encounters. Palace archives contain detailed charts showing which concubines received imperial attention on specific dates, how long these encounters lasted, and what gifts or favors were exchanged. Some records even include coded references to the emperor's mood and behavior during these meetings, creating a bureaucratic paper trail of imperial romance that reads like the world's most expensive dating diary. What's remarkable about these records is their matter-of-fact tone. Court scribes documented imperial romantic excess with the same professional detachment they used for recording tax collections or military campaigns. There's no moral judgment, no editorial commentary, just meticulous documentation of who did what, with whom, and when. It's as if the bureaucrats understood that imperial romance was simply another aspect of governance that required careful record-keeping. The survival of these records through centuries of political upheaval is itself remarkable. Dynasty after dynasty preserved the romantic documentation of their predecessors, even when those predecessors were considered enemies or failures. This suggests that Chinese political culture understood imperial romantic behavior as historically significant rather than merely personally embarrassing. Modern historians studying these archives have discovered patterns and trends that were invisible to contemporary observers. The bureaucratic nature of the record-keeping allows researchers to track things like seasonal variations in imperial romantic activity, correlations between political stress and romantic behavior, and the economic impact of romantic expenditures over time. The archives also reveal the enormous administrative apparatus required to support imperial romantic activities. Palace records mention hundreds of job titles related to romantic logistics: keeper of imperial schedules, coordinator of concubine affairs, manager of private entertainment, supervisor of romantic preparations, and dozens of others. Each position came with specific duties, salary requirements, and administrative protocols. Some of the most interesting archival discoveries relate to the international dimensions of imperial romance. Court records document elaborate gift exchanges with foreign kingdoms, including detailed inventories of exotic women sent as tribute. These records reveal that imperial romance was often a form of international diplomacy, with romantic gifts serving as symbols of political alliance or submission. The medical records maintained by imperial physicians also provide unique insights into the health consequences of imperial romantic excess. Palace medical archives contain detailed documentation of various imperial ailments that were clearly related to their romantic activities, though the physicians were diplomatically vague about the specific connections. These medical records suggest that imperial romantic excess often came with significant physical costs. Perhaps most fascinating are the financial records that document the enormous costs of imperial romantic bureaucracy. Palace treasurers maintained detailed budgets for romantic activities, including line items for everything from silk clothing and exotic perfumes to specialized furniture and architectural modifications. These financial records reveal that imperial romance was essentially a major government department with its own budget and administrative structure. The preservation of these archives also demonstrates the remarkable continuity of Chinese bureaucratic culture. The same administrative systems that tracked imperial romantic activities also managed taxation, military organization, and infrastructure development. Imperial romance was integrated into the broader governmental apparatus, rather than being treated as a separate or private matter. While we focus primarily on individual emperors and their romantic excesses, it's important to understand that different dynasties developed distinctly different approaches to managing imperial romance. These variations reflect broader cultural, political, and economic differences between different periods of Chinese history. The Han Dynasty, one of the earliest and most influential Chinese dynasties, established many of the basic protocols for imperial romance that would influence later dynasties. Han emperors typically maintained relatively modest harems by later standards, with perhaps a few hundred concubines, rather than thousands. The Han approach emphasized political alliance through marriage rather than personal indulgence, with most imperial romantic relationships serving clear diplomatic or administrative purposes. The Tang dynasty represented a high point of imperial romantic elaboration, with emperors like Xuanzong developing the concubine system into a sophisticated cultural institution. Tang imperial romance was notable for its integration with artistic and literary culture, with imperial romantic relationships inspiring some of the greatest works of Chinese poetry and art. The Tang approach treated imperial romance as a form of cultural patronage, as well as personal pleasure. The Song dynasty, by contrast, developed a more restrained approach to imperial romance that reflected their emphasis on scholarly achievement and administrative efficiency. Song emperors typically maintained smaller harems and showed less interest in romantic excess than their predecessors. This restraint may have contributed to the Song dynasty's remarkable longevity and cultural achievements, though it also may have reflected their military weakness and constant external threats. The Yuan dynasty, established by Mongol conquerors, brought a distinctly different approach to imperial romance that reflected their nomadic cultural background. Yuan emperors often maintained multiple wives of equal status rather than the hierarchical concubine systems favored by earlier Chinese dynasties. This approach reflected Mongol traditions of polygamy and the political integration of conquered territories through marriage alliances. The Ming dynasty represented a return to traditional Chinese approaches to imperial romance, but with increased elaboration and expense. Ming emperors developed some of the most complex concubine hierarchies in Chinese history, with dozens of different ranks and titles. The Ming approach emphasized ceremonial protocol and bureaucratic organization, turning imperial romance into an elaborate state ritual. The Qing dynasty, established by Manchu conquerors, attempted to balance traditional Chinese imperial romance with their own cultural traditions. Qing emperors maintained traditional Chinese concubine systems, while also incorporating Manchu practices like banner marriages and ethnic integration. The Qing approach was notable for its attempts to use imperial romance as a tool for cultural assimilation and political integration. Each dynasty also developed different approaches to managing the costs and political risks of imperial romance. Some dynasties implemented strict budgetary controls on romantic expenditures, while others allowed essentially unlimited spending. Some dynasties developed elaborate protocols for preventing romantic relationships from interfering with governance, while others seemed to accept political dysfunction as the price of imperial pleasure. The geographic variations within dynasties were also significant. Northern Chinese courts tended to emphasize military aspects of imperial romance, with concubines often chosen for their ability to provide military alliances or intelligence. Southern Chinese courts more often emphasized cultural and artistic aspects, with imperial romantic relationships serving as inspiration for poetry, painting, and musical composition. The seasonal patterns of imperial romance also varied between dynasties and regions. Some courts developed elaborate seasonal rituals around imperial romantic activities, with different types of relationships emphasized during different times of year. Spring was often associated with new romantic relationships, summer with elaborate entertainments, autumn with harvest celebrations that included romantic themes, and winter with intimate indoor activities. The influence of Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism on imperial romance also varied significantly between dynasties. Some dynasties attempted to integrate religious and philosophical teachings with imperial romantic practices, while others treated them as completely separate spheres. These religious influences sometimes led to periods of romantic restraint, followed by periods of reactive excess. While Chinese imperial romantic excess was remarkable in its scale and elaboration, it's important to understand it within the broader context of imperial romantic practices around the world. Comparing Chinese imperial romance with similar practices in other cultures reveals both unique aspects of Chinese imperial culture and universal patterns in how absolute power affects personal relationships. The Ottoman Empire's harem system shared many similarities with Chinese imperial concubine arrangements, including elaborate hierarchies, significant political influence, and enormous economic costs. However, Ottoman harems were more closely integrated with religious institutions and military organization than Chinese systems. Ottoman sultans often recruited concubines through military campaigns and religious conversion, while Chinese emperors relied more on tribute and internal selection processes. The Mughal Empire in India developed imperial romantic practices that combined Islamic, Persian, and local Indian traditions. Mughal emperors often maintained multiple wives of high status, rather than the extensive concubine systems favoured by Chinese emperors. Mughal imperial romance was more closely connected to architectural achievement, with emperors building elaborate monuments to commemorate their romantic relationships, most famously, the Taj Mahal. European imperial romantic practices were generally more restrained than Chinese systems, partly due to Christian religious influences and different political structures. European monarchs typically maintained official mistresses rather than extensive harems, and these relationships were often conducted with more discretion than Chinese imperial romance. However, the political and economic impacts of European royal romantic relationships could be just as significant as Chinese imperial romance. The Persian Empire's approach to imperial romance combined religious ritual with political alliance in ways that were different from both Chinese and European practices. Persian emperors often treated romantic relationships as religious ceremonies, with elaborate spiritual significance attached to imperial marriages and concubine selection. This religious dimension added complexity to Persian imperial romance that was less prominent in Chinese systems. Japanese imperial romantic practices were heavily influenced by Chinese models, but developed their own distinctive characteristics. Japanese emperors typically maintained smaller harems than their Chinese counterparts, but Japanese court culture placed greater emphasis on aesthetic refinement and literary achievement within romantic relationships. Japanese imperial romance was more closely integrated with artistic and cultural development. The comparison with other imperial systems reveals that Chinese imperial romance was notable for its scale, bureaucratic sophistication, and integration with governmental administration. While other empires developed elaborate romantic practices, none matched the systematic organization and enormous scope of Chinese imperial romance. Chinese emperors essentially created romantic bureaucracies that functioned like government departments. The international exchange of romantic practices also influenced Chinese imperial culture. Foreign concubines brought different traditions and expectations to Chinese courts, sometimes leading to modifications in Chinese romantic protocols. Chinese imperial romantic practices also influenced neighboring kingdoms, with Korean, Vietnamese, and other regional courts adopting modified versions of Chinese romantic systems. The diplomatic dimensions of imperial romance were particularly important in Chinese international relations. Chinese emperors often received foreign women as tribute, and these relationships served as symbols of international hierarchy and political submission. The treatment of foreign concubines could affect diplomatic relationships, with poor treatment sometimes leading to international incidents. The comparison with other imperial systems also reveals the unique role of eunuchs in Chinese imperial romance. While other cultures occasionally used castrated men in court positions, no other imperial system developed the elaborate eunuch bureaucracies that characterized Chinese courts. Chinese eunuch systems were unique in their scope, influence, and integration with imperial romantic administration. The global perspective also highlights the economic uniqueness of Chinese imperial romance. While other imperial romantic systems were expensive, none approached the scale of Chinese romantic expenditures. Chinese imperial romance represented perhaps the largest sustained luxury consumption in human history, exceeding the romantic expenditures of all other imperial systems combined. The logistical challenges of managing imperial romantic systems on the scale developed by Chinese emperors required significant technological and organizational innovations. These innovations, while designed for romantic purposes, often had broader applications that influenced Chinese technological and administrative development. The communication systems developed to coordinate imperial romantic activities were remarkably sophisticated. Palace administrators created elaborate messaging networks that could rapidly transmit information about imperial schedules, concubine availability, and romantic logistics across vast palace complexes. These communication systems required technological innovations in writing materials, message transportation, and information encoding that influenced broader Chinese administrative efficiency. The architectural innovations required for imperial romantic spaces pushed Chinese building techniques to new levels of sophistication. Emperors demanded specialized structures for different types of romantic activities, including heated pools, movable walls, and elaborate ventilation systems. These architectural innovations influenced broader Chinese building practices and contributed to the development of Chinese architectural expertise. The textile and clothing technologies developed for imperial romantic purposes were remarkably advanced. Concubines required elaborate wardrobes that demonstrated imperial wealth, while also serving practical functions related to romantic activities. Chinese textile workers developed new weaving techniques, dyeing methods, and fabric treatments specifically for imperial romantic purposes. These innovations influenced Chinese textile industry development. The transportation technologies required to support imperial romantic activities also drove innovation. Emperors needed elaborate vehicles for romantic excursions, specialized boats for romantic cruises, and efficient systems for moving large numbers of people and supplies to support romantic activities. These transportation needs led to innovations in vehicle design, logistics planning, and infrastructure development. The medical technologies developed to support imperial romantic health were also significant. Imperial physicians created specialized treatments for romantic-related health issues, developed contraceptive methods, and invented various enhancement techniques. These medical innovations influenced broader Chinese medical practice and contributed to the development of Chinese pharmaceutical knowledge. The agricultural technologies required to support imperial romantic consumption were equally important. Imperial harems consumed enormous quantities of specialized foods, including exotic fruits, rare delicacies, and aphrodisiac preparations. Meeting these consumption demands required innovations in agricultural techniques, food preservation, and supply chain management that influenced broader Chinese agricultural development. The security technologies developed to protect imperial romantic activities were also noteworthy. Palace administrators created elaborate systems for monitoring and controlling access to imperial romantic spaces, including specialized locks, surveillance methods, and identification systems. These security innovations influenced broader Chinese military and administrative security practices. The entertainment technologies developed for imperial romantic purposes pushed Chinese artistic and musical capabilities to new levels. Imperial romantic activities required elaborate musical instruments, sophisticated lighting systems, and complex staging equipment. These entertainment innovations influenced broader Chinese cultural development and artistic achievement. The time management technologies required to coordinate complex imperial romantic schedules were remarkably sophisticated. Palace administrators developed elaborate calendar systems, scheduling protocols, and timekeeping methods to manage the complex logistics of imperial romantic activities. These temporal innovations influenced broader Chinese administrative efficiency and planning capabilities. The record-keeping technologies developed to document imperial romantic activities were also significant. Palace scribes created elaborate filing systems, coding methods, and archival techniques to manage the enormous volume of documentation generated by imperial romantic activities. These record-keeping innovations influenced broader Chinese bureaucratic efficiency and historical documentation. The psychological dynamics of imperial romance reveal fascinating insights into how absolute power affects human behavior, emotional development, and relationship formation. The emperors we've examined tonight were not simply powerful men who chose to indulge in romantic excess. They were individuals whose psychological development was shaped by the unique experience of wielding absolute authority from an early age. Most Chinese emperors inherited their positions as children or young adults, meaning that their understanding of normal human relationships was fundamentally distorted by their imperial status. They never experienced equality in relationships, never faced rejection or disappointment in the way ordinary people do, and never learned to navigate the normal social dynamics that shape most people's emotional development. This psychological isolation created emperors who often struggled to form genuine emotional connections, despite having access to thousands of potential partners. Many imperial romantic relationships seem to have been characterized by a desperate search for authentic human connection within a system that made such connection nearly impossible. The elaborate romantic rituals and protocols that surrounded imperial romance often served to further distance emperors from genuine human intimacy. The psychological effects of unlimited romantic choice also created unique problems for imperial emotional development. When emperors could have any woman they desired, the actual selection process often became more important than the relationships themselves. Some emperors seem to have become addicted to the acquisition of new romantic partners, rather than finding satisfaction in existing relationships. The competitive dynamics within imperial harems also created psychological pressures that affected both emperors and their romantic partners. Concubines competed intensely for imperial attention, leading to manipulative behaviors, emotional instability, and various forms of psychological warfare. Emperors found themselves in the middle of these competitions, often struggling to manage the emotional demands of hundreds of jealous and ambitious women. The psychological burden of reproductive responsibility also affected imperial romantic behavior. Emperors were under enormous pressure to produce male heirs to continue their dynasties, turning romantic relationships into reproductive obligations. This pressure often led to anxiety, performance issues, and dysfunctional approaches to sexuality that further complicated imperial romantic relationship. The isolation that came with imperial status also created psychological dependencies on romantic relationships that were often unhealthy. Many emperors seem to have used romantic activities as their primary form of emotional expression and human connection, leading to obsessive behaviors and difficulty maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal and political life. The psychological effects of constant surveillance and documentation also influenced imperial romantic behavior. Emperors knew that their romantic activities were being recorded and monitored, which created performance pressure and often led to exhibitionist behaviors. Some emperors seem to have developed their romantic activities partly as forms of public display rather than private intimacy. The generational trauma created by imperial romantic excess also affected imperial psychological development. Many emperors grew up knowing that their fathers had neglected governmental duties in favor of romantic activities, creating complex psychological relationships with power, responsibility, and personal pleasure. Some emperors reacted by becoming excessively restrained, while others embraced even greater romantic excess. The psychological impact of unlimited power also affected imperial moral development. When emperors could do whatever they wanted without facing consequences, they often struggled to develop normal moral reasoning and ethical judgment. This moral underdevelopment frequently led to romantic behaviors that were exploitative, manipulative, or cruel, without the emperors fully understanding the ethical implications of their actions. The cultural expectations surrounding imperial romance also created psychological pressures that shaped imperial behavior. Emperors were expected to demonstrate their virility and attractiveness through romantic success, leading to competitive behaviors and insecurity about romantic performance. These cultural pressures often pushed emperors toward increasingly elaborate and excessive romantic displays. While most historical accounts of imperial romance focus on the emperors themselves, the experiences of the women within these systems provide equally important insights into how imperial romantic excess affected human lives and relationships. The voices of imperial concubines, wives, and palace women are often missing from historical records, but when they do appear, they reveal complex experiences that defy simple categorization as either victimization or empowerment. The selection process for imperial concubines was often traumatic, involving the separation of young women from their families and communities, with little chance of return. Many women entered imperial service involuntarily, either as tribute from conquered territories or as offerings from families seeking political advantage. However, some women actively sought imperial positions, understanding that romantic relationships with emperors could provide opportunities for social advancement that were otherwise unavailable. The daily lives of imperial concubines were characterized by a complex mixture of luxury and constraint. High-ranking concubines lived in elaborate palaces with extensive servant staffs, wore the finest clothing and jewelry, and had access to education, entertainment, and cultural activities that most women of their era could never imagine. However, they also lived under constant surveillance, faced severe restrictions on their freedom of movement and association, and were subject to complex hierarchical systems that determined every aspect of their lives. The competition for imperial attention created intense psychological pressures within imperial harems. Women competed not just for romantic access to the emperor, but for the resources, status, and security that came with imperial favor. This competition often led to alliance building, manipulation, and conflict that made imperial harems politically complex and emotionally challenging environments. The reproductive pressures faced by imperial concubines were enormous. Women who produced male heirs could gain significant status and security, while those who failed to become pregnant, or who produced only daughters, often faced declining status and reduced access to resources. This reproductive pressure created anxiety and stress that affected both physical and mental health. The educational opportunities available to imperial concubines were often remarkable for their time period. Many imperial women received literacy training, artistic instruction, and exposure to philosophy and literature that was unavailable to most women in Chinese society. Some imperial concubines became accomplished poets, painters, and scholars who made significant cultural contributions despite their constrained circumstances. The political influence that some imperial concubines achieved was also significant. Women like Empress Dowager Cixi demonstrated that romantic relationships with emperors could be leveraged into substantial political power. However, this political influence was always precarious and dependent on maintaining imperial favor, making it a risky and unstable form of power. The international dimensions of imperial concubine experiences were also important. Foreign women who entered Chinese imperial service often faced additional challenges related to cultural differences, language barriers, and isolation from their home communities. However, some foreign concubines also gained unique influence by serving as cultural intermediaries and diplomatic channels. The aging process was particularly challenging for imperial concubines. As women lost their physical attractiveness and reproductive capability, they often faced declining status and reduced access to resources. Some former imperial concubines were able to maintain influence through political connections or administrative roles, while others faced poverty and isolation in their later years. The religious and spiritual lives of imperial concubines were often complex. While they had access to religious education and spiritual practices, they also faced moral conflicts related to their roles within systems that many religious traditions viewed as problematic. Some imperial concubines found meaning through religious devotion, while others struggled with guilt and spiritual isolation. The relationships between imperial concubines were often characterized by both solidarity and competition. Women within imperial harems sometimes formed close friendships and support networks that helped them navigate the challenges of imperial life. However, the competitive nature of the system also created conflicts and betrayals that made trust difficult to establish and maintain. The legacy and historical memory of imperial concubines is also complex. Some women like Yang of Sui became legendary figures in Chinese culture, remembered for their beauty, influence, and tragic endings. However, most imperial concubines disappeared from historical memory, their individual experiences and perspectives lost to time. The collapse of imperial China in the early 20th century marked the end of over 2 millennia of imperial romantic excess. But the cultural, political, and social impacts of these systems continued to influence Chinese society long after the last emperor abdicated. The transition from imperial to republican and then communist China involved complex processes of cultural transformation that affected how Chinese society understood romance, power, and gender relationships. The Republican period saw deliberate attempts to reject imperial romantic traditions as symbols of feudal decadence and political corruption. Republican leaders promoted ideals of romantic equality, monogamous marriage, and the elimination of concubinage as part of broader modernization efforts. However, the influence of imperial romantic traditions persisted in subtle ways, particularly among wealthy elites who continued to maintain multiple relationships despite official disapproval. The Communist Revolution brought more systematic efforts to eliminate imperial romantic traditions and replace them with revolutionary ideals of gender equality and socialist morality. The new communist government outlawed concubinage, polygamy, and arranged marriage while promoting ideals of romantic love based on mutual respect and shared political commitment. However, the psychological and cultural legacies of imperial romantic traditions proved difficult to eliminate completely. The Cultural Revolution included specific campaigns against what were termed feudal romantic practices that connected imperial romantic traditions with political opposition to communist rule. During this period, any behavior that resembled imperial romantic excess was severely punished as evidence of counter-revolutionary thinking. However, these campaigns also demonstrated the persistent influence of imperial romantic ideals within Chinese society. The economic reforms that began in the 1980s created new opportunities for wealthy Chinese to engage in romantic behaviors that resembled imperial traditions. While polygamy remained illegal, the practice of maintaining multiple mistresses became common among successful businessmen and political officials. These modern arrangements often replicated the power dynamics and economic relationships that characterized imperial romantic systems. The globalization of Chinese society has also influenced how contemporary Chinese understand imperial romantic traditions. Exposure to international media and cultural exchange has created new perspectives on imperial romantic history, with some viewing these traditions as embarrassing relics of feudal backwardness, while others see them as expressions of traditional Chinese culture worthy of study and preservation. Modern Chinese literature, film, and television have extensively explored imperial romantic themes, often using historical relationships to comment on contemporary social and political issues. These cultural productions have shaped how modern Chinese understand imperial romantic history and its relevance to contemporary relationships and power dynamics. The feminist movement in modern China has provided new frameworks for understanding imperial romantic traditions, emphasizing the exploitation and oppression of women within these systems, while also recognizing the agency and achievement of some imperial women who successfully navigated these complex environments. These feminist perspectives have complicated simple narratives about imperial romance as either purely oppressive or romantically idealized. The tourism industry has also influenced contemporary understanding of imperial romantic history. Major tourist sites like the Forbidden City and the Summer Palace attract millions of visitors who learn about imperial romantic traditions through museum displays, guided tours, and cultural performances. This tourist presentation of imperial romance often emphasizes aesthetic beauty and cultural achievement, while downplaying the political and social costs of these systems. Academic scholarship has provided increasingly sophisticated analysis of imperial romantic traditions, using new methodological approaches and theoretical frameworks to understand these historical phenomena. Modern historians have moved beyond simple moral judgments to examine imperial romance as complex social, political, and economic systems that reveal important insights about power, gender, and cultural development. The digital age has created new opportunities for studying and understanding imperial romantic history. Online archives, digital museums, and social media discussions have made historical materials more accessible while also creating new forms of popular engagement with imperial romantic themes. These digital platforms have democratized access to historical information while also creating new forms of cultural interpretation and debate. Contemporary Chinese political culture continues to grapple with the legacy of imperial romantic traditions. Modern Chinese leaders are acutely aware of how personal scandals can affect political authority, and this awareness is partly shaped by historical understanding of how imperial romantic excess contributed to dynastic collapse. This historical consciousness influences contemporary Chinese political culture and expectations about leadership behavior. As we conclude our journey through the bedrooms and pleasure palaces of imperial China, we're left with a complex understanding of how personal relationships intersected with political power in ways that shaped Chinese civilization for over 2 millennia. These stories remind us that history is ultimately about human beings making choices that affected millions of lives, and that the personal and political dimensions of power can never be completely separated. The legacy of imperial romantic excess continues to influence Chinese culture, politics, and society in subtle but significant ways. Understanding this history provides insights not just into Chinese civilization, but into universal patterns of how power affects human relationships and how personal behavior shapes political outcomes. In that sense, these ancient stories remain remarkably relevant to our contemporary world. Sweet dreams, everyone. May your own romantic endeavors be more successful and less historically consequential than those of the emperors we've met tonight.